Hey guys, Darcy here today, going to talk about compression for beat making. Let's get into it. To talk about compression for a producer, specifically for people in hip-hop, I wanted to just cover a couple of scenarios in which I commonly use it. I interact with a lot of producers who are saying, you know, I don't know anything about mixing, or I see them slapping a compressor on everything, like every single track, and they don't need to. So I wanted to cover 3 scenarios in which you should be thinking about when to use compression. I'm not going to go over how to use a compressor. There are plenty of videos on YouTube that will teach you, what attack, release, and threshold and all that stuff is. But more so, I wanted to show you 3 scenarios in which I would apply compression, showing you a before and after, what it sounds like as I'm building this beat. And so the 3 scenarios that I'm going to go over: when you have a group of instruments, for instance drums, and you want to tighten them together; when you have an instrument that has a lot of dynamic range, it's loud and then it's quiet, loud and quiet, and you want to control that dynamic range so it sits more evenly with the other instruments and doesn't clash as much. And lastly, when you're trying to combine 2 sounds together to make a new one, like stacking 2 snares on top of each other. So the first example I'm going to show you here is when you're trying to tighten a group of instruments so they sit better together. It's very hard to, for instance, just manipulate the volume of every individual thing in a group of instruments until they sit perfectly, and that's where a compressor really comes to play. One place when you're making a beat that you should always be using this is on your drums. Essentially, you're going to have a bunch of drum tracks, a kick, a snare, a hi-hat, all kind of playing, and when you compress them, they tighten together, they feel more as one, and they'll also sometimes become more present and more forward. So what I have here, for example, is exactly that. So here's the before. And now here's the after with some compression on them. So you'll notice in this case that they seem a little more present, they seem a little more even, a little more balanced, and all basically tighter and more together. Now, one thing you shouldn't be doing when you're applying compression is just apply it to, say, every drum track for the sake of applying it to every drum track. There should be a purpose when you're doing this. When you apply it to a bus, you'll get a much better sound and you'll do a lot less work to get that. If you're applying to each individual one, it usually feel as unbalanced as it did before, but they'll all be slightly compressed differently. Here I have a sample, which I haven't done any chopping or anything, and it's quite dynamic. It has points where it kind of rises and then goes back down and rise. And that dynamic range, as you'll notice in the first instance, doesn't fully sit right. The volume at certain points works really well with the drums, but at other points it doesn't. And that's something you should pay attention to. You get the sound to a point where it mostly sounds on point and balanced, but certain parts feel maybe too quiet. This is a great time to be using a compressor to even that stuff out. So let me show you without compression. And now let me show you with compression. You should have noticed that it feels just like it sits better. It's still got quite a bit of volume to it. The volume actually doesn't peak any higher than it did before, but it just feels a bit more present. Alright, now this last part, what I've done is I've basically added another snare. I want to show you what happens when you have no compressor on it and then when you add the compressor. So let's hear it before. And now let's hear it after. They should just feel very slightly more as one. So that's really it for today. I just wanted to show some examples of when you should use compression. There are basically 3 scenarios when I'm making a beat that I mostly see that I need to add compression. One is when I need to group a series of instruments together and make them tighter, for instance drums, but sometimes even melodic instruments. Secondly is when the dynamic range of an instrument, commonly with like a sample or like, you know, piano or a guitar, where there's parts that are too loud, too soft, and you need to balance that out. And lastly, when you're stacking 2 instruments together to make one new instrument sound, like a brand new snare from 2 snares, you would want to compress that so they get really tight and feel a lot more like one single snare. Anyways guys, I hope you like this, I hope you find this helpful, and if you have found this helpful, make sure to like, make sure to comment, hit subscribe, and that's pretty much it guys. Peace.